So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Karen Oberhauser, Professor and Director of the UW Arboretum. Dr. Oberhauser is an expert on monarch butterflies and is particularly interested in inquiry-based learning and engaging students and teachers in conservation. Among many of her accomplishments is the development of the Monarchs in the Classroom K-12 education program and the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project Citizen Science program. Dr. Oberhauser, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Claire. It's really fun to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who's online watching this. So I just want to say a little bit. I see the chat box, so it's on the side of my screen. And if you do have a question that is really relevant to a slide we're on, it might be that my eyes glance over at that, or I might miss it because I'm focusing so much on what I'm saying. But sometimes a webinar is a nice opportunity to, engage in a little bit of conversation. But we have Rachel and Claire will be monitoring these questions. So if I don't see your question, you can chime in. Somebody else will see it and we'll get it answered at the end. So again, we'll see how this goes. But in the beginning, I'll just be talking and then answering your questions. So what I'll be focusing on today is monarchs as a flagship species for conservation. And we have this species that people really care about a lot. But in the end, what we do for monarchs is going to benefit a lot of other species. So that's kind of the way that I frame a lot of the conservation work that I do with monarchs. So what I'll be talking about today is kind of start with monarchs themselves and then go into people's relationship with monarchs and why they are such a good flagship species for conservation. And then think about some of the impacts on monarchs, some of the bad things that are happening with monarchs, and then what we can do to help them. So I'll start talking about the life history of monarchs. And this might be the part where you have the most questions. So again, it's going to be very brief. We could talk about this for a couple hours, but I'm just going to kind of put us all on the same page with the life history or the natural history of monarchs. So we start with what I call the individual life cycle. So just like any organism, monarchs go through a life cycle. And we'll start up here. Claire, can you tell me if people can see my cursor?
We cannot see your cursor, but I think if you click...
I can go up to this thing up here.
Yes.
Yeah, so let me see if I can select that and then... it's okay. I don't know exactly how I'm selecting it. No, we'll just go without the cursors. So if you go up in the upper left-hand corner, there's a picture of an egg, a monarch egg. It's about the size of a pinhead, and a monarch is an egg for about 4 to 5 days. This depends on temperature. It can be longer under really cool conditions, but under normal summer conditions, it's about 4 to 5 days. Egg hatches, becomes a caterpillar. It's a caterpillar for 9 to 13 days, and you can imagine that it's a lot smaller when it first hatches out of an egg the size of a pinhead. And over the course of these 9 to 13 days, the caterpillar increases its body mass about 2,000 times. So it grows a lot, and basically it's just eating milkweed during this time. It then pupates and becomes a pupa or a chrysalis. It's the chrysalis for just a slight amount shorter, a shorter period of time, like 1 day less than it's a caterpillar under, again, normal summer conditions. And then the butterfly, the adult butterfly, emerges from the pupa. And what's interesting about the adults is I have the same lifespan for each of the other stages, but you'll notice for the adults that I say it can be adult for 2 to 6 weeks or for 8 to 10 months. And the difference there is the ones that are an adult for 2 to 6 weeks are non-migratory individuals. And the monarchs that are alive right now that are in Mexico are kind of in the middle of, or towards the end actually, of an 8 to 10 month lifespan. So they live longer as adults if they migrate. And you might think that sounds like a good thing to live longer, but they actually don't reproduce until the end of the winter. So they're putting off reproduction for all this time, and that's kind of a risky period for them. So it's actually better, I think, to be a butterfly in the summer because you don't have to migrate before you reproduce. So there's the individual life cycle. And during the period, monarchs need milkweed. And Dan, I see your question about migration and non-migratory behavior, and I'm going to talk about that in just a couple minutes. So thanks for asking that question and reminding me of that. So monarchs as larvae eat only milkweed, but there are over 100 milkweed species that are native to North America. So I picked pictures on this slide that kind of represent the morphological diversity. So you can see on the top, this is actually a species that we have in the upper Midwest. It's called whorled milkweed, or Asclepias verticillata. This species has these skinny little needle-like leaves. Common milkweed is on the upper right. And then there's my favorite milkweed on the bottom left, which is called desert milkweed. And this species actually has no leaves at all. The caterpillars eat the stems of this plant. So there's a lot of diversity of milkweed species, and monarchs can eat pretty much all of them. The other thing that monarchs need during this life cycle is nectar, because they're relatively long-lived for insects. They have to eat during the period that they're adults, and you can see here that they nectar on a variety of different flowers. So here, if you start with the monarch on the lilac in the top, that's not a native species. I realize that, but it's actually a pretty good nectar source for monarchs and when they're coming back in the spring. Then we kind of go through the species. If you go clockwise around this circle, there's coneflower, which is available in the early summer, bee balm, Joe Pye weed, the bottom right, black-eyed Susan, New England aster, blazing stars. So they need nectar plants for the whole time that they're in an area. So monarchs return if you're in Wisconsin or Minnesota. They get back here mid to late May and then are here into September, and they need to have nectar available for that whole time. So now I'm going to get to Dan's question about migration and non-migratory behavior. So over the course of the summer, monarchs are breeding, and at the very last generation of the year, because they're being exposed to shorter day length and bigger differences between daytime and nighttime temperatures, they respond to this by going into a physiological state that we call diapause. And I don't have that word on this slide, but if you want me to spell it, it's D-I-A-P-A-U-S-E, diapause. And that is a period, it's a period at which an insect's development is arrested. Thanks, Claire, for typing that. And what this means is for adult monarchs, they emerge, they look exactly like the monarchs that emerge in the summer. But those in the fall, if you dissected them and looked at their reproductive organs, they would be undeveloped. So they're responding to environmental conditions and putting off reproduction. So the monarchs that are following these arrows on this map are not reproductive, although they look exactly like butterflies in the summertime, like monarchs in the summertime. And these diapause individuals are following these migratory routes. If you look at the kind of the bigger stippled area that's surrounded by the stippled line, kind of the northeastern quarter or so, or more than a quarter of the U.S., monarchs are leaving these areas in the east, funneling down through Texas and ending up in central Mexico. And there's another population west of the Rocky Mountains that migrates to sites along the coast of California. But there is some interchange, as you can see from this line going from about Arizona towards the Mexican sites. We know that some individuals from Arizona end up in Mexico. So there's this beginning of what we call the annual cycle, and these are butterflies migrating south in the fall. They then spend the whole winter in Mexico, and then those very same butterflies, so they arrive in Mexico kind of early November, they start leaving in the middle of August, Then those very same butterflies fly north out of the overwintering sites in the kind of mid-March, so they'll be leaving in a couple weeks, and they recolonize the southeastern quarter of the United States, and then their offspring recolonize their summer breeding range. And you can see we have this arrow going out of Mexico into Arizona. We aren't really sure that that happens, but we think that it probably does. And you can see that the migratory pathways for the butterflies from the west are much shorter than those from the east. Okay, so then we have these butterflies that are the offspring of the ones that overwintered, and they go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations up here. So if you're in the upper Midwest, I see a lot of you are from Wisconsin and Minnesota, but some from other places too. They go through 2 to 3 generations, breeding up here. These are the ones living only 2 to 6 months. And then the cycle starts again with the last generation of the year that migrates south. So this is the annual cycle, migrating south, overwintering, migrating back north, and breeding. And what's unusual about monarchs is even though they cover such a large area, they're together for a significant portion of the year, so we're able to get a handle on the size of their population. So I've kind of indicated that on these maps with circles, showing us that we can count monarchs, and I'm going to show you some graphs of the size of the monarch population when they're all together. It's really difficult to count insects, and especially for species like monarchs that are spread over such a big area. But with monarchs, we can kind of tell what's going on. And so now what I'm going to do is kind of talk us through that same 4 stages with pictures to kind of give you a sense. Instead of just looking at a map, we can kind of see what's going on. So if we start over here on the left with fall migrants, during this fall migration, monarchs need nectar plants. So during that whole migration, they probably eat every day. So this is a picture of New England aster, monarch nectaring on New England aster. They also stop at night. They don't migrate at night. So this is a mesquite tree, the picture of the monarchs clustered together. A mesquite tree, I took this picture in Texas. So they stop along the way. And then if we move through the arrows to the bottom pictures, monarchs overwintering in Mexico, for the most part, they cluster in trees and don't move very much. So you can see these monarchs clustered on a branch together. But sometimes when the sun hits them just right, you see these amazing monarchs flying off of the trees. And I couldn't include this in the webinar because I couldn't do animation, but actually it's really amazing to watch them all flying around when they're doing this. And then as the monarchs are coming back, if we move over to the right side of this circle here, they have to drink nectar. So as they're moving into the United States and northern Mexico, they're getting nectar plants, and they're basically moving north with milkweed. So here you see a picture of laying an egg on a little tiny milkweed plant that she's found. This picture was taken in Oklahoma. And then the top pictures are meant to represent the monarchs up here. This is when the population is expanding. Females are laying eggs on milkweed. Caterpillars are eating that milkweed, and they're needing nectar. So this is a circle. This is a chain. You can think of it as a chain, and you know that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if any one part of this cycle is lost, the whole migration collapses. But I've spent a lot of time at the overwintering sites in Mexico, and when I look at the butterflies clustered on the trees like they are in this picture, I think of the fact that every single one of those butterflies has an amazing story of survival. Only about 2 to 5% of the eggs become adults. There's incredible mortality during the early stages of the monarch cycle. So these are just amazing survival stories represented by all these monarchs in Mexico. And each one of these survival stories starts on a milkweed plant, most of them up here in the upper Midwest. So while it's a chain, while we need the whole thing, this is really the base of it, is the milkweed plants that feed the caterpillars that will become these monarchs that migrate. Okay, so Dan asked the question, do the California monarchs breed with the others? We don't really know. We think that, we know that they, in a lab, they'll breed with each other. Whether or not they do that in the overwintering sites in Mexico, we don't really know. Are the monarchs themselves able to identify diapause versus reproductive individuals? Well, not by just looking at them. So, and we know that because male monarchs who are not in diapause will try to mate with females who are in diapause. So we think that they probably can't distinguish between diapause and non-diapause individuals. And as they're migrating, he also asked if they cluster on any tree. Yes, they pretty much take what's available. So they'll cluster on conifer trees. So during this fall migratory phase, they'll cluster on conifer trees, deciduous trees, shrubs, bushes. In Mexico, most of the trees there's not a lot of diversity in the overwintering sites. So mostly what they cluster on in Mexico are Oyamel fir trees. It's called, the scientific name is Abies religiosa. It's really closely related to the fir trees that we have up here. And yes, clustering is for energy conservation, and just because they're all in the same area, they're both conserving energy, but they're also just finding the best trees, and so they cluster together just because they're all happening to go to the same trees. Okay, so that is it for my little brief introduction to monarch biology. And now I just want to kind of really quickly talk about people's relationship with monarchs. Because there are more than 1 million species of insects, and here we are giving a whole webinar on monarchs, and people are really, really interested in and concerned about monarchs. So I want to talk just a little bit about that. And one of the manifestations of this interest is the fact that monarchs are really intensively monitored. So we as people are out there counting monarchs in many, many different ways. And I've kind of represented in this circle here the same phases of the annual cycle that I talked about. And this list over here on the right is, I'm not going to talk through, oh, you're saying, whew, she's not going to talk through all these things. But the point is that this is a long list. And all of these are programs where people are going out and collecting data and helping us understand about monarchs. So that is a real sign of people's interest in and concern for monarchs. And just an example of one of the projects of all the ones that I listed there is a program called Journey North. I'd be really interested if any of you have ever participated in Journey North. If not, I recommend that you do. It's a really simple citizen science project, and we're actually going to be hosting this project at the Arboretum. This project is moving to the Arboretum, so we're pretty excited about that. But this is an example of the amazing kinds of data that people are collecting. So each one of the dots on this map represents a monarch roosting site, like the one I showed you the picture of on the mesquite tree. And you can see over here, this represents the whole migration last fall, and we have dates. So we can basically see as the colors get oranger or redder, these are monarchs migrating down through Texas into Mexico. We don't have as many observers in Mexico. We have some, but this is mostly people in the US and Canada who are recording these roost sites. And then what we can do is compare from year to year. So now the bottom map has switched to be 2017, which was year before last. And you can see that there are a lot more monarchs that people were seeing in 2018, which is the top map here, the one I showed you first. Bottom one is 2017. So we can look over the years, what are the differences in the numbers of monarchs that people are seeing when they're migrating, the pathway. You can see that there was more movement along the Gulf Coast and along the Atlantic in 2017 than there was in 2018. So you can imagine how valuable all of these data are as we accumulate them year after year. And we have more than 2 decades of data from Journey North. So I really recommend, I can type in here. So you can just go to journeynorth.org, I believe, and get information about the citizen science program. It's a great thing to do with kids. All right. Another really important thing about people's interest in monarchs is that they're creating monarch breeding habitat. So here are sites at a nature center in somebody's yard. The bottom right one is in a national forest. This is a CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, on the upper right. People are creating habitat for monarchs. They're putting up signs. The top sign says that this site is a monarch way station. The bottom one says that people are engaging in the citizen science project that my lab at the University of Minnesota, before I came to Wisconsin, ran. And now we're moving a lot of this project here to the Arboretum as well, so the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. So people are putting up habitat, putting signs in that habitat, and using the habitat to monitor monarchs. So that's just a little bit of evidence. And now I'm going to spend not a lot of time, but a little time about how monarch numbers are declining. Because this is one of the reasons they're getting so much attention now, because their numbers are going down. So this graph shows you, remember I said that we can monitor monarchs in the wintertime when they're in Mexico. So this graph shows you the area that's covered with trees, covered with monarchs in Mexico. And this is in hectares because it's in Mexico. And you can see that there's a lot of variation from year to year. It goes up and down, up and down. But overall, it's gone down, except we had this really exciting bump up this year. So we were up to over 6 hectares this fall. And the numbers, sorry, I forgot to take these other numbers off, but the 5.7 is the long-term average. So over all of the years that people have been collecting this information. But these 2 lines show us the decade averages. So you can see for the last decade, even though we bumped way up this year, even including that number, our average for the last 10 years is 2.7 hectares covered. And just for your information, a hectare is a little more than 2 acres. So it's easier for us to think in acres. But for the previous decade, it was 6.4 hectares. So numbers have really gone down a lot. We get up and down. We're really excited when it happens, when we get a big up. But you know, one year we're excited about this year, but we can't say we're out of the woods with monarchs because the number went way up. And what happened? So the long-term trend is probably changes in habitat availability. But these big changes from year to year, from 96 to 97 or from 2003 to 2004, are probably mostly due to weather. So we have good years. This last summer was a perfect year for monarchs, so we got this bump up, but we also get bumps down that are driven by weather conditions. Okay, so for this long-term trend, what's driving this? And one of the things that's driving it is the change of habitat. So this graph is showing you in little pixels across the map habitat that's being lost and that's being translated into milkweed stems. So habitat that used to be grassland that's being converted to cropland. And this happened, the data on this graph or this map are from 2008 to 2016. And this is reflecting the loss of Conservation Reserve Program land, or CRP land. So this is a huge source of habitat loss for monarchs. And the other thing that's happened is we've lost a lot of land due to not necessarily conversion of the habitat, but different management practices. So in 2000, a whole bunch of scientists went out onto the landscape, and we looked in corn and soybean fields. And we saw a lot of milkweed growing. This was all over Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Maryland, Ontario. We measured milkweed in corn and soybean fields. And here you can see this is a cornfield on the left, upper left, a soybean field on the upper right. There's a lot of milkweed in these fields, and monarchs were laying eggs on this milkweed. And then based on the amount of corn and soybean habitat out there, we estimated that about 50 times more monarchs came out of corn and soybean fields than out of non-ag areas. But pretty much all of that habitat is gone, and that's due to herbicide use on genetically modified crops. So farmers can now spray their crops with herbicides after the crops have come up, and here you see a picture on the bottom. The bottom is it's a soybean field. The soybeans look fine. There's actually a little milkweed plant in the center of this screen. The farmer sprayed Roundup on this field. It killed everything else, but not the soybeans. So we can't really blame farmers for wanting to control weeds in their fields, but this is what we have to make up for. This is habitat loss. And here you see, we did this study in 2000. So the bottom line on here is Roundup Ready corn. So that was the very first year there was any Roundup Ready corn on the landscape. About half of the soybeans by that year were Roundup Ready, but now it hasn't really changed since 2014, so I don't keep updating this graph. It's about 92% of corn and soybeans are now Roundup Ready. So all these fields that used to have milkweeds in them no longer do. So that's the big driver. I mean, we know weather is a driver too, but weather is something that causes that year-to-year variation, and habitat loss is probably responsible for the variation that occurs on the long-term downward trend. So then the question becomes, we know about the biology of monarchs, we know what's driving, or at least an important driver of the trend, so we can ask ourselves the question, how do we respond to this? So I'm assuming that we care about saving monarchs. So the kind of how do we respond to this knowledge that monarch numbers are declining, given that our hopeful goal is to save monarchs. So I'm trained as an ecologist, but I'm a conservation biologist. And I know that we can study things until we're blue in the face, but unless we act on that knowledge, we don't make any progress. So conservation is really an action-oriented field. We need knowledge, but then we have to act on that knowledge. So what we know is that to achieve a sustainable monarch population, we need engagement from all society. Nobody can solve this problem on their own. So the picture on the top here, you might think this is a little weird. She's showing us a picture of a row crop and a talk about conservation, but actually the crop that's growing in this picture is milkweed. And this guy is hoeing the milkweed field, not using any herbicides, so he's getting the weeds out by hoeing. And this is a seed source for restoration for milkweed. So that's one of the kinds of action. We need seeds to plant in the habitat that we'll create. The bottom picture is kids in Mexico, and these kids are planting trees for the monarchs in Mexico. So I'm representing here, you know, we need this conservation support across the whole migratory cycle. So what can we do in the United States? So what we've done is a study of how much habitat we can get from all kinds of different spaces. And I imagine that most of you are at schools in urban or suburban areas, or maybe some of you are in rural areas, but schoolyards, your individual yards, churches, businesses, all sorts of places can have monarch habitat. And this is actually a picture of my yard before I moved to Wisconsin. I haven't done this in my Wisconsin yard yet because I have a lot of trees in my yard. But this was a really great monarch habitat. This is what you can do in a schoolyard garden, like the ones that Earth Partnership promotes. And monarchs loved my garden. I had a lot of monarchs. There was a lot of milkweed in there, and there were always monarchs in my garden. So urban and suburban spaces, we can do a lot. You know, a lot of species that we care about can't live very well. Like if we were talking about wolves, we wouldn't be talking about what you can do in your schoolyard or your front yard for wolves, but or whooping cranes or something like that, but we can do something in our yards and schoolyards for monarchs. Unfortunately, this is what a lot of urban and suburban spaces look like. So this is the thing we want to guard against. This picture I took in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a couple years later, and this you can tell is kind of a new development, but hopefully some of those people started planting more than just a few trees in their yards. Okay, the other thing we can think about as a possible source of habitat for monarchs is agricultural set-aside land. So this is land that farmers are pulling out of production and putting it into other habitat. And this habitat has a ton of value. This is a strip. It's called a prairie strip in Iowa between the cornfield. And this has a lot of, it controls erosion. It improves water quality. So there are a lot of good things that happen, but it also can provide habitat for monarchs. So this would be CRP land or any kind of ag set-aside land. So this is kind of a societal decision. How much are we going to support farmers who pull their land out of production to provide a benefit for all of us, but it doesn't necessarily provide them with income? Another interesting source of habitat for monarchs is rights-of-ways. So this picture is a right-of-way along a highway. We can also have rights-of-ways along utility corridors or railroads. And these rights-of-ways can provide habitat. Now, there are some risks associated with especially roadside right-of-way habitat. The adult monarchs can get hit by cars, especially on this interstate that's right next to this picture. But there's also can be drift from ag fields if the ag fields are right next to there. So there's, you know, there are risks to this, but in a lot of areas of the U.S., basically this is the only habitat that's left. So, you know, maybe subprime habitat is better than no habitat. We also have protected lands. So these are lands that are already protected that might not be managed in the best way for monarchs. So this is a national forest, national grassland managed by the U.S. Forest Service. But there are city protected lands, state protected lands, county, lots and lots of protected land that is already there for conservation purposes, so we can make that land better for monarchs and other species that we care about. And finally, I think this is a really interesting slide. So this slide is showing us where protected land is in the United States. So the kind of cream-colored background in this picture is privately owned land, and the colored is habitat that's protected at different levels. And you can see that the upper Midwest, where most of the monarchs come from, doesn't have a lot of protected land. So basically the point of this is that we really need to get private landowners involved with monarch conservation. So finally, the last category is land that's currently in agriculture, but that's marginal for one reason or another. And as we know, there's been a lot of flooding because of huge rain events. And this is not good for agriculture. I mean, we think rain is good for fields, but too much rain is bad. So here we have a cornfield on the left and a soybean field on the right. These fields are not going to be productive this year. And it turns out that there's actually a lot of land being farmed that on average it loses money. So if we could pull that land out and give the farmers some credit for doing that, we would have a lot of additional habitat for monarchs and other species. Yeah, so the question about Dan about more and more ag land, it's not necessarily owned by corporations. So Monsanto doesn't do a lot of farming on their own, but ag land is getting, farms are getting bigger, and they are owned by corporations, they're farming corporations, not necessarily Monsanto. So yeah, there is a lot of effort to try to work with both the land managers for agricultural areas and also the land owners, the farm, the people, and sometimes it is a company that owns a lot of farmland. So definitely, but Monsanto is not really in the business of farming. They're in the business of producing the chemicals that we use on farms. Okay, and the last thing before we kind of get into the questions here, I just want to talk about how conservation requires action, but it also requires hope. There are a lot of bad things going on out there in the world if you're interested in conservation. And I think, what gets me out of bed in the morning is the fact that so many people are working on conservation. And this slide is a lot of different organizations, international level, groups in Mexico that are working on monarch conservation, groups in the US, and groups in Canada. So this picture, I've put a circle around here because I'm just going to talk about it for a second here. It's the monarch venture. And, interesting, 98% of farms in the US are family owned. That's a good point. That's individual farms, but if we looked at the amount of farmed land, it would look very different. Because the family farms tend to be smaller and big farm land, and families can own a lot of land, and it might not be that they're the ones actually farming the land. So yeah, I talked to a lot of ag economists, and it is really interesting to think about size of farms and who owns the farms, who manages the farms for the owners. So that would be a whole interesting talk. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so back to the Monarch joint venture, where we have all these organizations working to promote monarch conservation. And this slide just shows you all of these different organizations. So these are all of the organizations, and this is actually of a few months ago, that are part of the Monarch joint venture. So these are organizations that are working together to promote monarch conservation. And this gives me great hope that we have these organizations. And I had to circle the UW Arboretum. We were the first Arboretum to join the Monarch joint venture. See here. So what can you do in your schoolyards, with your families, for monarchs? Big thing is create habitat. That's the most important thing we can do for monarchs. You can contribute to citizen science, and I mentioned the Journey North program, but there are a lot of other programs that help us understand monarchs. You can support. A lot of schools raise funds to support conservation or other charitable causes. So you can support conservation organizations who are working to preserve habitat and spread the word. And this is what you as teachers are doing, is helping spread the word to your students, who then spread it beyond you. So these are the big things that I think of as action, conservation action. And I just, before I end, want to point you to a few resources. So this is the website, excuse me, of the Monarch Joint Venture, this monarchjointventure.org. And this is a great place to go for resources about monarchs. So if you go to this website, there are a lot of different tabs at the top, but I circled resources. And one of the things that I think might be useful to you, I'm not going to summarize everything on that website, but under the resources, we have a lot of one-page that are just all sorts of different information about monarchs. And I didn't slide, but just to illustrate, there's one about schoolyard butterfly gardens, conservation talking points, so all sorts of handouts about monarchs. So with that, I'm going to end. And so, Dan, your question, if farms are the highest priority, this, I think that's a really interesting philosophical question. All we as individuals can do is to approach, we can try to change policies, but as individuals, we might have the most impact by talking to individuals who we might know. So yeah, I think that really the answer to Dan's question is it really depends on your comfort level and who you know. Place to purchase common milkweed seed. There are a lot of native seed sourcing places that have common milkweed seed now. So yeah, you can do some web searches. And actually on the Monarch Joint Venture website, we have a kind of a seed sourcing resource page for different places you can find. So now I'm actually going to turn the reins over to Claire, who I think has been collecting questions that came in separately. So Claire, do you have questions on your list that people have asked?
I do, and thank you so much for that presentation that talked about so many different important aspects of the monarch butterfly's life, and then also how we can take action to protect it. Really good information there. I did want to take the opportunity to thank Monarch Joint Venture, who, along with the Sand County Foundation, We Energies Foundation, and Enel Green Power, were sponsors of the publication of Earth Partnership's Pollinator Habitat Guide last year. And we'll include a link to that guide in our follow-up email along with the recording of the webinar tonight. But during our workshop in Buffalo, Minnesota, which Gary helped host in his classroom last summer, we explored that guide and we saw a neat example of another avenue of conservation, which was Enel Green Power. One of their solar fields was also used as prairie restoration. So they have been rolling out a plan to really underneath the solar panels. They plant beautiful native prairie habitat that also, of course, supports pollinators as well. We've got some cool photos from that visit that we can send along, but just highlighting that as another example of land that can be used to plant some of these really important plants. Dan, yes, this presentation will be available online. We'll send out a recording, and we can also post a recording on our website. So the first question that I have is from Tim, who's a 4th grade teacher at Port Edwards School District in Wisconsin. And Tim wants to know if there's a certain tree that attracts monarchs or that monarchs use on their migration south.
Sorry, I started talking and I was on mute. We knew this would happen. So during the migration south, monarchs use all different species of trees, so they're pretty opportunistic. And we don't really know the characteristics of the exact locations, but they do, there's something about particular sites that attract them because, you know, you'll see a whole bunch of monarchs in one place and not in other places. So we don't know what attracts them to certain trees, but it does not seem to be specific species of trees.
Okay, thank you. Donna Polnuck, who's a professor emerita from the UW-Madison, writes in and she asks, well, she says that current development groups often strive to create home designs that provide privacy for those who purchase the properties. However, in doing so, they often fragment wildlife habitat within the area of that development. Her question is, what current ecological strategies are being devised and are used to try and bridge these gaps in order to restore habitat activity? And she has special interest in whether seed balls might be a possible strategy.
Hi, Donna. It's great that you're here. So those are kind of two different questions. And I'm going to start with the second one, the seed balls question, because I am super interested in that. For those of, I think probably since a lot of you are teachers, you know about seed balls because it's a really common engagement technique. They're these little balls that have a lot of clay in them with seeds in them, and then it's like guerrilla gardening kind of. You get these seed balls and throw them like bombs onto the earth, spreading seeds around. So that's never been studied. We actually don't know the effectiveness of seed balls, and excitedly, we have a project going on at the Arboretum to study the impact of seed balls, specifically for milkweed. But yeah, we don't know the answer to that, but it's interesting. And the question about home designs, I think that's really interesting too. And I think that kind of comes from those action categories of what we can do by spreading the word. And I think, you know, people like privacy, and there are a lot of things that we as humans do that we think of our own comfort, you know, our own happiness and health, and kind of ease of living, where we think of these things from a really species specific, we think of their impact on us. And I think that it kind of requires a mind shift to really think of the impact on other organizations or other organisms when we make these decisions. So I think that fragmentation is a real problem. And if you look at urban landscapes, they can be really fragmented, but when there is some green space left, like in that picture I showed in Kalamazoo, that from a monarch's perspective could be a fairly unfragmented habitat. And there are roads, but a road is not a big deal to a monarch. But as long as, you know, if there were big chunks of those lawns, if people would join together and neighborhood associations would promote more sustainable and gardening and landscaping that's more friendly to other creatures, it could make a difference. So that becomes kind of a spreading the word. We need to have people think about these things when they make their individual decisions about their own lifestyles. That's a super interesting question.
Great. One of our participants was lucky enough to be in Costa Rica recently, and she saw monarch butterflies there. So she was wondering if there is a monarch population that travels south of Mexico, and she also noted that the butterflies looked a little worse for wear.
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that question. I didn't include a slide on that, often I do, but so I'm glad you asked it. There are actually monarchs. Monarchs are a New World species. They probably evolved in the tropics, either Central America or Mexico. And they've evolved to, the North American monarchs have evolved to migrate into big habitat areas in the spring and summer, and then they go back to essentially the tropics in the wintertime. But they've been spread around the world. And Costa Rica, so Costa Rican monarchs are part of the same species. It's not a subspecies. It's the same species of monarchs that basically, if we think of monarchs kind of evolving probably in Mexico, they've moved north and south. So monarchs actually go pretty far into South America. But there are also monarchs in many other places. So there are monarchs in Hawaii and Australia, New Zealand, all through the Caribbean, even in Portugal and Spain, southern Portugal and Spain. And these monarchs have probably been moved around by people. We don't know that for sure, but I would find it pretty far-fetched to imagine a monarch getting blown across the ocean to Australia from North America. So we think that they got moved by people. We don't have records of that. So there are monarchs in a lot of different areas. And those Costa Rican monarchs, I've never seen them myself, but I've had students who have studied them, and they have really high rates of some parasites. So yeah, they do look a little worse for the wear. I would agree.
Very interesting. I mentioned that we had the Pollinator Habitat Workshop this past summer, and many of the educators in that group are agricultural ed teachers, and who in their school projects are not necessarily working on schoolyards, but are maybe involved in school community partnerships. For instance, one class is helping a farmer plan and plant pollinator habitat on his land outside of the school. Based on your experience, do you have strategies for communication or tips for educators who are working with community partners and farmers in particular? And also, I can put it out to the group if anyone has experience with this. I know Gary's an ag ed teacher. If you want to add any of your thoughts in the chat window on this as well.
Yeah, that is such a good question. And again, I think it's kind of a matter. I'm going to address the communication with farmers first. There are a lot, and let me see if I can go back. So there's actually quite a lot of engagement through the Monarch joint venture. I'm not going to be able to find it, so probably it isn't worth me going back here. But we have a lot of organizations that are that naturally work with farmers. So, for example, Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever have a lot of farmer partners. I've gone to a lot of Pheasants Forever meetings and, have met a lot of farmers. Somewhere on here is the Sand County Foundation. I'm not seeing it right now, but it's right on here. The Sand County Foundation works really closely with farmers. This towards the bottom middle, right next to the map of Minnesota, you see the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. That organization is focused on working with farmers. NRCS is part of us, the way at the top, works with farmers. So definitely there's a lot of outreach. And there's a whole group called the Keystone Group, which is facilitating interactions between a lot of members of the Monarch Joint Venture and the ag industry. So Monsanto is a part of that group, Syngenta. So definitely our kind of strategy for working with farmers has been to engage groups that already have those connections. So it's really important. And I think the first part of your question was about other groups as well. So basically what the strategy of the Monarch Joint Venture is to pull in all of these groups that have their own audiences and then provide them with the materials, so the resources like these handouts that are here, all these different handouts that are relevant to different audiences. So we pull in groups working with these audiences and then provide them with the materials that help spread the word.
Right. Thank you. Someone else writes in and said that she's got a friend who notices that a field near her is getting mowed after monarchs are laying eggs. Is there anything that we can do to protect eggs in public fields or areas that that we see this kind of thing happening in?
Yeah, so that is a great point. So it's mowing fields, mowing roadsides. That's one of the risks of planting milkweed on roadsides is they get mowed. One of the handouts, and it's not one of the ones in this screenshot that I put on this slide that's up right now, but we do have a handout that gives latitudinal ranges for mowing times that would be the least harmful to monarchs. So you can time mowing. There's always going to be some monarchs around, so you run the risk of killing some, but it would be good to avoid mowing when there are, the maximum number of monarch eggs and caterpillars in a field. So definitely the timing of mowing can make a difference. If a field can be mowed during the times that monarchs aren't there. And that just takes communication. So again, having this handout available and just going to talk to the people in charge of the mowing. I think most about roadsides, but this sounds like it's another kind of habitat. But with roadsides, what's interesting is, we think of highways because that's what we drive on the most, but really most roadsides are mowed, they're mowed at the township level. So, it's just some guy out there on his tractor mowing the roadsides. Often it's landowners. So it really can be an individual communication, just saying, hey, this is a time when there are a lot of monarchs out here. Could you wait a week or mow a week earlier when there aren't a lot of monarchs? So again, it's that individual communication. And Gary, question about how to get those handouts. If you go to the monarchjointventure.org under resources, you can click there and all of the handouts are available as printable PDFs. So you can print them. If you want a lot of them to hand out, you can contact the Monarch Joint Venture, and there's a link right on that page. You can contact the Monarch Joint Venture and say, I need 200, and they'll give them to you for the price of shipping. So you can either print them for free or get them and just cover the cost of shipping.
That's great. Um, Maybe time for one or two other questions. One is about the cultural significances of the monarch butterfly, which we know of maybe especially in Mexican culture, and as a symbol of immigration. Awareness of this importance seems to be growing. It was even noticed monarchs were featured briefly in the Disney Pixar film Coco, which takes place on Dia de los Muertos. Do you have any thoughts or have you had any experiences about how the cultural significances of the monarch can be engaged as part of citizen science or conservation efforts?
Yeah, I think about that a lot because I do a fair amount of work in Mexico. So definitely there is that cultural significance in Mexico. The monarchs coming back kind of symbolize the soul, returning souls of the dead at the Day of the Dead. And there's, if you look on pyramids and all over in Mexican culture, there are a lot of connections to monarchs and other butterflies. I think we don't have this, so it's really strong in Mexico. We don't have the same kind of cultural significance of monarchs, but we do have these personal connections between people and monarchs. And I think we can take advantage of that. And I think there are a lot of reasons monarchs are a pretty familiar species. People have seen them. They recognize them and they care about them. They're pretty. We as people like pretty things. They have this amazing migration. An individual monarch weighs as much as a paperclip. They can fly all the way from Minnesota or Wisconsin to central Mexico, which is a pretty amazing athletic feat. So they're impressive. So I think for all these reasons, we can take advantage of these connections people have. And I give a lot of talks about monarchs to a lot of different kinds of groups, and I hear so many stories that people have. You know, they tell me their stories about, you know, their aunt's funeral. The monarch flew by and landed on her daughter's hat or something. So there are just all these stories about people's connection with monarchs, or they remember raising a monarch when they were in third grade. They saw them at their family farm when they were little. They saw a tree covered with monarchs. So people have naturally formed those connections, and we can take advantage of those connections to have people create habitat for monarchs, and in doing so benefit a lot of other species.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for those answers. We are at 5 o'clock already. I did see Dan is typing. So if you're, Dr. Oberhauser, are you able to, okay, Dan says he'll quit. We do want to respect everyone's time here. Thank you so much for joining, to everyone, and especially to our expert speaker tonight. Thank you, Dr. Karen Oberhauser. If I might go back to your last slide, just because you put your contact information here. Are people able to get in touch with you if they have any other questions that come up?
Sure, I'm happy to answer questions, and email is the best way. The Monarch Joint Venture is not a contact information for me. It's just to remind you that you can get so much information there. But yeah, I'm happy to answer emails.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to get this information, and then also to be reminded of how many people are out there doing good work from all different kinds of organizations, from schools to the Arboretum to places like Monarch Joint Venture, that we're in it together to help protect these species. So thank you to all, and I guess have a good evening.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you to everyone. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your good questions, too.